Hi, this is Rusty, and here we'll be discussing settler colonialism. So, as some of you might be aware of, early last month, the Israeli state began a process of eviction against Palestinian families living in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem where thousands of Palestinians live, and they all face eviction as well. This process stretched back for decades, and currently there's no sign of it ending. This was followed by an assault by Israeli police force against Palestinian worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site for Islam, and injuring more than 600 Palestinians. This culminated in the bombing of Gaza by the Israeli state, and despite a ceasefire being reached, 256 Gazans were killed, including 66 children, and more than 2,000 were wounded. Looking across to the other side of the Atlantic, you may have noticed news of the recent discovery of the remains of 250 indigenous children at their unmarked grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School here in BC, Canada. Just today, June 12, 2021, a further 104 potential graves were also identified at the Brandon Indian Residential School in Manitoba. And these are just two of a total of 130 residential schools that operate in Canada throughout its history. So in light of these tragedies, one question we can ask ourselves is simply why? Is there an underlying reason for all these long-term violence? And is there a connection between what's happening in Israel and what's happening in Canada? And the answer to these questions are yes, there is a common thread, if you will, to all of this, and that common thread is settler colonialism. Now, to further understand settler colonialism, it might be useful to first understand what the heck is plain old colonialism. So, vanilla colonialism, if you will. A simple definition for this vanilla colonialism is the domination and subjugation of a nation and its people by an imperial home country, usually for economic reasons, so resource extraction, exploitation of local labor, among others. And to help illustrate this, one example we can look at is the British colonial India, the British colonial Indian Empire. Back then, from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s, India was under a freaking company, the Dutch East India Company, for example. And this illustrates the purpose of this colony very well, the export of goods, the exploitation of labor. And at its height, it was extraordinarily successful. At its height, the British East India Company accounted for half the world's trade, and they did this by exporting cotton, silk, indigo dye, sugar, salt, spice, tea, opium, and yeah, among others. A lot of goodies. It's no wonder they're so prosperous. This prosperity, was not shared with the Indian populace, however. And in fact, the Indian populace only endured the suffering. Nothing illustrates this better than the Great Indian Famine of 1876 to 1878. Back then, despite the fact that the British colonial government knew that on the Deccan Plateau there were widespread crop failure caused by intense drought, the British colonial government was in fact more concerned about helping their local populace too much, instead of being concerned about the fact that they're starving. There was concern that resources going to be wasted, and wheat that could be exported were going to go to people who don't need them. So the British colonial government in fact exported some 320,000 tons of wheat to Britain in the midst of one of the most severe famine of the time. Modern estimates put the fatality of the time in India at around 8.2 million, so it was very, very severe and a lot of people died. If this sad story sounds familiar, that's because a grimly similar tale happened in Ireland. Ireland, of course, is a lot smaller than India, so less people died, but nonetheless, 1 million Irish died and 2 million people become refugees because of the Irish potato famine. This decimated Ireland's population by some 20 to 25%, and Ireland till this day, has not reached pre-famine population. So yeah, these are the grim tale of vanilla colonialism, and certainly it's a dreadful flavor. But what's up with settler colonialism? Well, as the name implies, a new ingredient is involved, and that's settlers. So where there are settlers, there of course needs to be a place for the settlers to settle in. And for this purpose, we shall use the United States as an example. Well, it's not the United States yet, it's the 13 colonies, but we'll get there soon enough. Anyways, settlers are sent in, and initially they're sent in by a home country for the benefit of their home country, obviously. So in this case, Britain might send in people because they want to alleviate population pressure back home. Maybe there's just a tad bit too much poor people in their urban center like London. Maybe there are some filthy refugees from Ireland, for example, that need to be settled somewhere. Regardless of the reason they're sent, these settlers are sent to this new world, quote unquote, to serve the home country. So it might be to exploit local land, local resources, whatnot. Despite their original intention, these settlers will later morph into their own being. More on that at 6 though. Now the other thing about this whole process is that the land they are looking at here are not empty nor free. The land here are not, as this shady looking chap is suggesting, free real estate. It is in fact not free. And that is a big problem for settlers, as settlers are not looking to peacefully coexist with indigenous people. What this necessitates is settler violence against the indigenous population. In the context of the United States, this can take the example of the Trail of Tears, or it can take the example of what's being depicted in this picture here, where the US Army is conducting a campaign of genocide and displacement against the local Cheyenne population. Now, while this violence is being inflicted, another problem arose. Basically, people don't like to think of themselves as the bad guy, as this fella here is coming to realize, even though they're conducting wanton violence against other people. So there needs to be some sort of justification, some sort of ideology, if you will. And this is where settler colonialism comes in. Settler colonialism is the ideology, the justification that underpins the violence against indigenous people. It is the building of not just a settler institution, but a whole new settler nation. Often there's a racial and religious component to this ideology. So, white people are superior to non-whites, pious Christian over the non-Christian, etc. For Israel's case, for Zionism, this expresses itself in the goal of establishing a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Nonetheless, it doesn't always have to be like this. It doesn't always have to be a religious component to this. And this project can be a secular nation-building project as well. The United States encapsulates this really well. Starting off as a series of British colonies, the US soon decided to rebel against its imperial mother country and proclaim itself a nation of enlightenment, of human rights, liberal democracy, and that kind of stuff. Funny enough, it doesn't extend to black slave and indigenous people. And yeah, that kind of shows you the contradiction here. Many other national mythologies are being created just despite the creation of this settler colonial states. So for example, you might have heard of the Manifest Destiny, where there's this idea that the United States has the God-given right to claim territory across North America. This also manifests itself in the vernacular of the time. So there's the idea of Western frontier, the idea of ruling the West, virgin land, they call it, etc., etc. Now, despite everything that happened so far, indigenous people often persist. They continue to resist. They persist in trying to preserve their livelihood and their culture. And that's the problem for this burgeoning new state, as the mere existence of indigenous people is a challenge to the legitimacy of the settler colonial state. So as we know by now, the settler colonial project is extremely violent. Yet, from the perspective of the settler colonial states, oftentimes the violence is not enough. And by that I mean they're not able to literally wipe out the indigenous population. And to continue to do so might inflict a high military or political cost to the state. And that's where the violence change forms. You see, they need not to literally wipe out a population. They can, for example, destroy their way of life. And one great example of that is the culling of buffalo, where the US almost extinguished the buffalo population. As you can see in this picture, this was planned as a way to starve the indigenous population on the plain into submission, because the Lakota people, among others, rely on buffalo as their way of life, as their food source. In the role of then US President Ulysses Grant, the destruction of the buffalo was a solution to the US so-called Indian problem. Just north of the border, here in Canada, we have the residential school, of course. On the surface, of course, the justification for the residential school are pretty nice. The idea is to educate and civilize the indigenous children to help them integrate into broader settler society, all that kind of good stuff. And nothing illustrates this better than this picture, which was shown to our high school student back in high school in our social studies textbook. Here we have our indigenous children before he was taken away from their parents in the left, and on the right where they're supposedly civilized and educated. Now, regardless of whether they believe in these bolsters themselves, the practical result of this was to sever their children's connection to their parents, to their homeland, their culture, their language. It was basically a project of cultural genocide. If the children survived that, is arguably is a project of outright genocide, considering how many children literally died in these schools. But regardless, this residential school system persists to this day. The last residential school closed in 1996, so that was very late, extremely recent, within my lifetime in fact. Yet despite that, the supposed closure of the residential school system, the residential school system lived on in other form. And that is where this poster comes in. So I come across this poster a few weeks ago, and what it is campaigning for is the end of the Ministry of Children and Family Development, so MCFD, as you can see here. Now, here in Canada, we have a foster care system. I suppose it's all over the world, but here in Canada, it is of special prominence. Once again, next to the residential school system, the idea of a foster care system sounds kind of fair. You know, if children are at risk, they should be put into a caring foster family in safety. Sounds good, no? Yet the data from the government of Canada itself suggests that just over 50% of the children in foster care are Indigenous, despite the fact that Indigenous children only account for less than 8% of the whole child population. According to the BC Representative of Children and Youth, in BC, some 98 children died in foster care between the June of 2017 and March of 2018. Among this number, once again, about half of them are Indigenous. So once again, a disproportionate number of Indigenous people are A, being held in foster care, and B, dying in foster care. So even though the residential school system is officially technically dead, arguably in practice it continues to live on here in Canada. Looking back to Israel, I think we can now see how Israel is basically a settler colonial state now. Now, what's different about Israel from the other settler colonial states is the fact that it is in its early stage of settler colonialism. Large-scale Jewish migration to Israel only started within the last century, and the state of Israel itself was only established in 1948, as we can see on this newspaper here. Whereas other settler colonial states like US, Canada, Australia, etc. have gone through this process for a much longer period, and the indigenous population in these countries are unfortunately much more marginalized. Israel is a nation-building project born from settler violence and displacements, as we can see in the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their home and tens of thousands were killed. There is a racial and religious undertone to this nation-building project. Israel is supposed to be an ethnically Jewish state. Toward that end, Palestinians who do wind up as Israeli citizens are treated as second or third class citizens. And of course, if you're a non-citizen, they'll try to repeatedly displace you. The racial element of this project is especially clear when we see Israel expelling and sterilizing the black Hebrew population within Israel. Only white ethnic Jewish are allowed here, you see. Israel sees continuous expansion, like most other settler states, and here you can see how it had relentlessly pushed to continuously expand its territory at the expense of Palestinians, and how Palestinians continue to shrink and shrink. Israel is also a creation of imperialism, supported by other settler colonial states, not only due to a shared ideology, but also mutual interest. For the US, Israel served as a place to displace American Jews, but also as an imperial outpost, while Israel, of course, benefited from US military largesse. Lastly, an important note on the two-state solution. This idea is often thrown around by both Zionists and the sympathizers of Palestine. The important thing to note about the two-state solution is that it's never just. It's never a just solution. as it means a concession of a majority of what should be Palestinian land toward the creation of an Israeli ethno-state. It's basically also just a rhetorical tool, a rhetorical shield used by Zionists to gesture toward some sort of ambiguous peace process, while continuously expanding into Palestinian land, as you can see in the light green area here. Considering this reality, the two-state solution is practically impossible anyway, so enough of this unjust solution, a solution wanted by neither side at any rate. To achieve justice, we need a single state with equal rights for everyone, and that state must be Palestine. So to recap, we have vanilla colonialism, and then we have a new ingredient called settler. When it comes to settler, there's of course a need for a destination where they settle in, and because those places are not in fact free real estate, that necessitates settler violence, and the development of settler colonial ideology. This settler violence can change forms, and the best example of that might be the residential school system, and there is a succeeding iteration of it. And after going through all that, you might ask, what to do? That's a fair question. And I say to that, we need to look at what the people fighting settler colonial violence are seeking. So for example, the Palestinian people. Toward that end, it is important that we support the BDS movement. No, I don't mean BDSM. Although I guess if you're into that, that's cool, I guess. But no, I mean BDS with no M. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the key thing about the BDS movement is that it is a Palestinian-led movement. Now, a component of that, of course, is the good old consumer boycott. You can find all the Target on this website, and currently they're boycotting Israeli fruit and vegetable, HP, the computer brand, Puma, the sportwear brand, and Pillsbury. Unfortunately, this little white fella is a Zionist. Sad. But beyond consumer boycott, an important part of PDS is the blockading of Israeli goods too. And in places where the dock workers have strong union, often these dock workers are some of the strongest allies the Palestinian people have. In places like the US, where the labor movement is weaker, activism can help. So here we have an example of how an activist rally helped start a transport ship because the rally also inspired the dock worker to stand in solidarity with them after learning of the purpose of their protest. So these are things we can do to support the Palestinian people. When it comes to the indigenous population that live closer to home, there's Land Back. As the name suggests, Land Back is a movement seeking the return of land to their rightful owners, so the recovery of indigenous land. But also, there's more to Land Back. It also seeks the recovery of indigenous language, indigenous culture, ceremony, etc. Besides that, of course, we should also hold our political institutions accountable. So here, the poster I mentioned, where they're seeking to abolish the MCFD and to stop the foster childcare system. And various other campaigns like this one. These are all campaigns we should support. When possible, we should support our indigenous brother and sister in their campaign as land defender and water defender against the unjust exploitation of their land. Here in BC, we have indigenous resistance against the coastal gas link pipeline in the Western territory back in early 2020. As shown in this picture, the military corps was sent in by the state because, in the end of the day, the settler colonial state value natural resource exploitation above respect for indigenous people, despite the fact that our own courts recognized their land claim. Back then in 2020, a lot of actions in solidarity were sprung up across Canada. Railroad was blocked and that kind of stuff. And we need to keep doing that in solidarity with indigenous people. Now, all that can sound very tough and bleak, and I can understand that. So to end this, I think it would be useful to simply look at a sample of successful decolonization movements. And yes, those do exist. The most obvious example, of course, is the end of South African apartheid. What I think many people do not realize is that the parallel between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid are extremely strong and potent. Both were extremely violent, well, for the Israeli state, are extremely violent. Both were strongly backed by its Western imperial country, and it was after years of campaign and intense public pressure that finally compelled ever-increasing economic divestment from South Africa. This ever-increasing divestment and strong local pressure eventually pressured the South African apartheid regime to realize that they cannot continue to exist as an apartheid regime, and that propelled them to seek negotiation with Nelson Mandela and his African National Congress Party. That led to the dissolution of this regime and democracy, true democracy, in South Africa. Now, South Africa is by no means perfect at the moment. The process of decolonization ought to be an ongoing process, and that's what's going on right now. A lot of progress still needs to be made, and there's a lot of stuff that can be improved. But nonetheless, I think what happened here is an important triumph that we need to recognize. Going to an example that may be less similar but nonetheless notable in my opinion, we have Bolivia. In Bolivia, Evo Morales of the Aymara people and a former head of the Cocoa Leaf Growers Union was elected the first indigenous president of Bolivia in 2005. Morales was the country's first indigenous president despite the country being majority indigenous throughout its history, so it was a very historic and notable event. Morales then implemented a policy program that drastically reduced poverty, which disproportionately affected indigenous people, and instituted a new constitution that proclaimed Bolivia as a plurinational state, a state of many nations. And here we see the government emblem that's trying to embody the spirit of being a plurinational state, where you see all these different patches represent different indigenous nations within Bolivia. One way Morales' program bore through is also in the development of what is called Andean architecture, which is the incorporating of Aymara culture into this new building. I'm probably just showing you these buildings though because I think they look cool. Lastly, something closer to home. Here, closer to home, well, I live in Vancouver, so this is closer to home. We have success achieved by the land back movement as well. Here we see the removal of dams along the Klamath River and the return of indigenous land in California to the Assyrian tribe. These are just a few examples of the success achieved by the land back movement. All this is to say, I think the project of decolonization is certainly a difficult one, but it's very much a possible one. And in the end of the day, I think a better world is indeed possible. And with that, this video has come to an end. Thanks for listening through that. 22 minutes, I guess. That's not too bad, although I was hoping it would be shorter. Trying a new format here, of course, as you can see for how it looked like a PowerPoint slide, because it is. And really hoping to smooth things out and maybe lower the length of the video. Any suggestion on how I can improve things, make it a bit more pretty, make it better written, be it on the content or the technical aspect, will all be appreciated. So yeah, that'd be nice if you have anything to say. Oh, and also I'm starting to do something that look like this, where the list of reference and extended reading I put down in the description on YouTube, I'm going to put a few stars on a few articles that I think are especially good read. I mean, they can be good read because they are short and concise, to the point, or just insightful in my opinion. The other articles, they're also good, but you know, they might not be as relevant, they might be much longer, etc, etc. Anyway, let me know if you find that helpful. With that being said, thanks and have a good day. Bye.